Hello, my name is Carol Schall, and I'm the Director of Technical Assistance with the Virginia Commonwealth University Autism Center for Excellence. Today, I'm presenting a webcast entitled An Ounce of Prevention, Reducing Interfering Behavior by Being Proactive. I welcome you to the webcast, and if you're joining us live, I'll be able to chat with you at the end of this webcast. If you're viewing this webcast in our archived a library of webcasts, I thank you for viewing it, and I hope you find it helpful. Let's begin. As we look at this webcast, we're going to be discussing strategies to prevent behavior at home, in school, and in the community. And so as we prepare, one of the things that we have to understand is we have to understand a little bit more about problem behaviors and why we hypothesize they occur. In this example, I have a kind of a crude drawing of an iceberg. And if you've watched the movie Titanic, or if you've learned about iceberg from your elementary school days, what you remember is that the tip of the iceberg is only the smallest section of what really exists. That under the water level, there's much more going on. And the example of an iceberg related to problem behavior is a good one, because we see the behavior, which might be hitting or crying or some other form of problem behavior from an individual with autism spectrum disorders. When we look at the iceberg below the water level, what we might find out is that this individual with autism might have difficulty imitating the behavior of others. So, for example, maybe they hit because a child took a toy from them and they viewed that as an assault, so they're hitting back because they don't understand how to imitate sharing. Or maybe they have difficulty with executive function, that ability to plan out tasks and engage in them fluently. And so the hitting was exhibited to avoid an unpleasant situation, like having to plan out and figure out what to do when there's a fire drill. Finally, not finally, but another example might be difficulty formulating theory of mind. An individual with autism might not understand that hitting results in the other person not liking you, and so therefore they may hit to accomplish an immediate goal without considering what the long-term impact would be on the person who might be a friend of them. In other words, we see an odd or a problematic behavior. That's the tip of the iceberg. What we don't see is what's happening underneath that behavior that leads to the problem behavior in the first place. When we try to prevent problem behaviors from occurring, we have to understand this iceberg theory related to problem behavior. Simply suppressing or responding to the problem behavior of hitting will not change the circumstances that led to the hitting in the first place. And so what sometimes happens when we don't attempt to prevent the circumstances that lead to hitting is that we might suppress hitting, but we might get worse behaviors instead. It's like chopping off the top of that iceberg. The problem is still under the water, and the iceberg will grow back. And so instead of seeing hitting, we might see a bigger problem behavior like biting, or throwing my materials, or engaging in some other kind of problematic behavior that is actually worse than the original behavior. So our goal in using an ounce of prevention is to prevent the behavior from occurring in the first place. The title of this webcast comes from the old saying, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's in fact going to be harder for us to address a problem behavior that has shifted or grown back. Instead, we want to try to prevent the iceberg from forming in the first place. So our job is to understand the person with autism well. And in understanding them, we want to understand the meaning of that behavior. We want to try to figure out what that iceberg has underneath it. We want to try to figure out how we best meet the needs of that person in the environment in which the behavior occurs. Now, that doesn't mean that it's the same function in every environment. What that means is that we have to really understand the function of the behavior. And let's say the behavior, hitting, occurs at school, and also occurs at home. We have to understand what hitting means at school. And then we have to understand what hitting means at home. It doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in all environments. So we want to make sure that we intervene in each environment in a way that works for that environment. We also have to intervene with compassion. As we know from some of our previous webcasts and from our knowledge of students with autism spectrum disorders, this is a disorder related to communication difficulties and social interaction difficulties. And consequently, we have to keep in mind that it's really hard to be a person with an autism spectrum disorder. By that, I mean that people with autism spectrum disorders have a difficult time communicating. And so simply suppressing a behavior that may be communicating a very important message is something we have to be aware of. So we have to have compassion when we're intervening. We have to help that person with autism become not only more effective at meeting their needs, but also more effective at interacting with others, despite the problem behavior and despite the condition. And so our compassion comes from our understanding that for a person with autism, it's pretty hard to make it through the day. I have 3 S's that I frequently talk about when it comes to behavioral support. And these 3 S's are in a specific order for a very important reason. I'll describe each of them as we walk through them. The first one is safety. Frequently, individuals with autism display problem behavior because they don't feel safe in the environment. That doesn't necessarily mean that the environment is unsafe. What I mean by that is the person perceives that they're unsafe. If a person with an autism spectrum disorder fears that they won't be understood when they're hungry, when they have a very important need that needs to be met, they are more likely to use problem behavior. Any of us would. Imagine being in an environment where no one understood you, where your language wasn't spoken, and you had a very important need. Do you think you personally might engage in some behavior that is unusual or different, or maybe even challenging, to avoid being unsafe? In fact, people with autism frequently feel unsafe because they're unable to say, I'm really hungry, I'm really thirsty, I'm in pain, I don't like the way things are happening, I'm very scared that you won't understand me. And so we have to make sure that we work with individuals to identify those specific environmental elements that keep them safe, that provide safety for them. For many people with autism, this translates into providing them with a consistent schedule, so that they have a daily routine and a daily activity that really meets their needs, that really provides them with a very clear idea of what's expected of them throughout the day. And so for many of our individuals with autism, safety begins with a consistent schedule. The next point in the 3 S's for behavior support is security. When we talk about security, again referring to individuals with autism, what we're referring to is a sense of belonging. Frequently, peers of individuals with autism spectrum disorders do not know how to communicate with them. The fact that individuals with autism and their peers with autism spectrum disorders don't know how to communicate doesn't mean that they don't want to interact with others, that they don't want to play, that they don't want to have a rich and full life of people who love and care for them. And so security means that we help that person with autism establish a peer group. That peer group serves 2 very important purposes. First, it's the network of support. Imagine going through your life. Imagine going through difficult times in your life without friends. That's what people with autism spectrum disorders do every day. Our research tells us that people with autism spectrum disorders have fewer friends than their peers without autism. And so one of the things that we want to pay attention to is the peer group. For those of you who work with and teach individuals with autism spectrum disorders in public school or community settings, you have peers available to you in the individuals without disabilities. And so one of the things that we should always look for is ways to include individuals with autism in fully inclusive environments, at recess, in PE, in science, in reading, in math, in all of those school-based and community-based areas where there are peers that the person with autism spectrum disorders could become friends. The security of having a support network helps you make it through difficult times. Secondly, that peer network models appropriate behavior. And so by ensuring that individuals with autism spectrum disorder have access to peers without disabilities, we're actually ensuring that they have access recess to peers who will show them how to behave in recess, in the cafeteria, in situations where it might not be exactly clear what the rules and expectations are. The final S in the 3 S's for behavior support is success. Once you've established that the person is safe in the environment, is secure in a peer network that cares about them and will help them, then you can begin to work on that person's success. And so you can't have success before you have safety and security. As I mentioned, these 3 come in a very specific order. When we're preventing problem behavior from occurring, these are the 3 S's that we want to pay attention to. In order to solve problem behaviors and use visual strategies, first you have to complete a functional behavior assessment. There will be another webcast that you can refer to learn more about functional behavior assessment. We've also provided you with fact sheets and some research articles on the resources part of our webpage where you can find more information on how to complete functional behavior assessment. In essence, completing a functional behavior assessment means that you understand the connection between the environment in which the person displays a problem behavior, the behavior itself, and what the person is communicating with that problem behavior. In other words, behavior is a communication. For all of us, not just for people with autism, we all use challenging behavior to communicate a message. I want you to think about the last time you had an argument with a significant other in your life. Did you, in the midst of your anger and frustration, say, "Excuse me, I'm feeling overwhelmed by the emotions that are bubbling up in me right now. I need a short break, and once I process my feelings, I'll be able to discuss this rationally and calmly"? Or did you slam a door? Or maybe throw something? Or maybe yell, "Leave me alone"? Those are all problem behaviors, aren't they? Throwing, slamming, yelling. And yet you use them to communicate the message that I verbally gave earlier, that I'm frustrated and I'd like a break so that I can talk to you after I calm myself down. In other words, your problem behavior in that moment functioned to get you away from or out of a difficult situation. The same is true for people with autism. And so when we complete a functional behavior assessment, what we're asking is, what's the connection between this environment, the behavior, and what the person is trying to communicate, perhaps ineffectively with their problem behavior? Our goal is to listen carefully to the behavior early in the cycle so that the person doesn't have to shout at us by throwing things, by yelling, by having a tantrum. Those are, quote, shouting behaviors that we want to prevent by listening earlier on before they have to shout. So as I said, most of the behavior that you see, even when we're supporting individuals with autism spectrum disorder, is communicating a message. Even the odd behaviors that you might see, when a person bites themselves, they're telling you something with their behavior. And by paying attention to that message and responding to that message, we can prevent that behavior from occurring. Behavior is tied to social context. That is, who was present, what were the expectations when the behavior occurred, what was the person being asked to do. Finally, all of us, as I referred to early, use challenging behavior to meet our needs. When you're frustrated, your behavior, your yelling, throwing, slamming things behavior, is communicating and meeting your needs at the time to be left alone from a particular person who's causing you frustration. The same is true for people with autism. They are using their challenging behavior because it meets their needs effectively and efficiently. In order for us to prevent that problem behavior from occurring, we have to understand that. And by understanding that the person is using this behavior to meet their needs, the behavior may in fact be challenging and frustrating and troubling to us. But the needs frequently are not. The need that the person is expressing is something that we do want to pay attention to. So in order to change that behavior, in order to prevent that behavior, we have to understand what triggers it. And there are 2 types of triggers that we pay attention to. The slow trigger is what might set up the possibility of a problem behavior. It doesn't set it off. The slow trigger is something that might occur prior to the problem behavior occurring, by hours or even days. Frequently, the slow trigger is something like feeling ill, a change in my routine, being told bad news, or just being in a bad mood. I happen to be the parent of a 13-year-old, and I'm learning a lot about moodiness these days. I know that my daughter's mood can be a slow trigger for her arguing with me. We don't have many arguments, frankly, in my household, which I'm grateful for, but when an argument occurs, I can usually say there was probably a slow trigger present that might have set up the possibility that an argument might occur. It doesn't set it off, but it just sets it up. There is a fast trigger always in the environment that sets the behavior off. In the case of my 13-year-old, the fast trigger might be saying something like, clean your room, or do your homework. So my daughter, my 13-year-old daughter, is already moody. That's the slow trigger. And then I say, clean your room, which leads to an argument, which is her way of communicating, I want to avoid engaging in this task. So we pay attention to that trigger that sets it off, particularly when we're attempting to prevent problem behaviors, because by paying attention to what sets the behavior off, we might be able to think of another way to have that trigger occur or to avoid it altogether. In the case of my 13-year-old, I might be more effective by giving her a written checklist. That way I'm not verbally interacting with her and an argument might not occur. For a person with autism, I might change that trigger in some way. So if I find that a person with autism frequently tantrums or engages in a problem behavior when they're asked to change activities, I might change the way I offer them new activities so that they're making a choice. And by making a choice, we might see a reduction in the problem behavior. Again, by understanding the triggers, the slow trigger and the fast trigger, we're going to be able to intervene to change those triggers so that we prevent the problem behavior from occurring. The other aspect of our work is to understand what strengthens the behavior, the problem behavior. And what we want to understand here is what the person gets or avoids that they'd be willing to risk displaying the problem behavior. That's the important question that I want you to pay attention to. What does the person get or avoid that they're willing to pay the cost of their behavior? In the case of the argument, my daughter avoids the task. In the case of a child with autism who maybe is tantruming when their schedule changes, they avoid the schedule change. Maybe they get attention from the adult who helps them make the schedule change. And so on the list below, you see that there are 4 functions. Individuals engage in challenging behavior to seek attention, to escape an unpleasant situation, because it feels good, it's self-stimulating in some way, or to get something tangible. Of those 4, the first 2, attention and escape, are the most frequent causes of problem behavior. On rare occasions, you'll see both of those interacting together. But for the most part, people engage in problem behaviors to get attention or to escape a challenging situation. And so when we're attempting to prevent problem behaviors, we want to be aware of those 2 functions, because we could prevent a problem behavior from occurring if it's an attention-seeking behavior by providing more attention before the problem behavior occurs, especially when the triggers are present. Let's take the example of someone seeking attention in the face of being left alone. Okay, so let's imagine a person with autism is in a classroom, maybe it's a preschool classroom, let's say it's a 4-year-old with autism, and they've been left alone to play. Now, this 4-year-old with autism doesn't really know how to play because of the disability itself. And they have peers in the preschool around them attempting to play. And this person with autism, in the face of this confusion and not knowing what's expected of them, begins to take toys and hit other kids on the head. And when that happens, the teacher comes over and pays attention to that young child with autism. We might prevent that situation from occurring by beginning to model playing behavior and sitting down with that child with autism and one other child and paying attention to that child initially, getting them started in play with the peer and then slowly fading out. By intervening, by providing attention in before the problem behavior occurs, we avoid having to correct the problem behavior. Again, that's the way we might use this information, the function of the behavior, to help us prevent the problem behavior from occurring. Inevitably, there's a first time for everything. So the first time that child with autism displays the problem behavior of wandering around and hitting all of his preschool peers on the head with the toys, you didn't know what the function was. It's never happened before. So you didn't know how to prepare for it. And so here are some steps in the face of a new problem behavior that will help you respond strategically rather than reactively. First, stop and take a very quick, deep breath. The purpose of the deep breath is to help you think through the problem. If you just simply respond, you may end up actually strengthening rather than weakening the behavior. Let's say in the case of the preschool child who's walking around and bopping the other kids on the head. By stopping and taking a quick cleansing breath and thinking, you're going to give yourself time to observe the triggers, to observe the behavior, and to observe the consequences that are strengthening that behavior, so that when you respond, your response is strategic rather than reactive. That's again another way that we want to use that ounce of prevention principle, by responding strategically. The picture on the left-hand side of the screen is purposefully a chess piece. Chess is a game that requires strategy. When we're interacting with children with autism who have challenging behaviors, we want to use the same calculating strategy that someone uses when they're playing chess. We want to understand that by moving one piece, it's not a single move. It impacts the future of the game, and it impacts the future of the way we interact with that child. And so by engaging in these four simple steps, we can avoid interactions that lead to more problem behaviors in the future. I've frequently been asked to consult in classrooms with teachers who have children with challenging behavior. And what I find is frequently those teachers have experienced situations where the challenging behavior becomes worse and worse and worse because the strategy that they used during those first few episodes of problem behavior was not strategic. Once we've identified the function of the problem behavior, and we've used strategic intervention to interact, then we want to develop a hypothesis. The upper right left-hand corner with the purple starburst is the hypothesis development. That's an aha moment. When we finally understand the function of the problem behavior, we are then able to think about the antecedents, think about alternative skills to teach the child, enact consequences that both reduce the problem behavior and increase the new behaviors. And then we are able to think of long-term prevention strategies and, most importantly, how to support team members who are supporting a child with autism. These are the elements of a comprehensive positive behavior support plan, where we're addressing not just the behavior itself, not just the consequences that occur after a behavior occurs, but we're thinking long-term about the needs of the individual and long-term about the support for the team members who will be working with this child across time. This is an important aspect of our work, that we not just think about how do I eliminate this behavior today, but how do I help this person be more independent and not need this behavior in the future? The essential components of our behavior support plan include prevention, teaching new behaviors, and reacting or responding to the old behavior so that it is weakened, and to the new behaviors so that they're strengthened. When we talk about prevention, we're really talking about a way to make that problem behavior unnecessary. By doing that, we are going to use a lot of visual supports for our students with autism spectrum disorders. We're also going to be sure to provide regular sensory experiences that increase calm. Now, when I talk about this, I don't mean highly specialized occupational therapy strategies in which you have not been trained. I mean everyday activities that we all engage in to help us calm down. Many of us find that after we've been sitting for a long, long time, that getting up and taking a walk helps us refresh, helps calm us down. After a frustrating interaction or when we're under a lot of stress, some of us go out for a run. And that sensory activity of getting rid of some energy helps us refocus and reset our day. Those types of regular sensory activities also help individuals with autism cope better with frustrating, challenging, and confusing environments. We want to organize the environment to promote clear expectations. And perhaps one of the simplest and most profound strategies that we can use to prevent problem behavior is by providing choices to individuals that we support. I have a quick story here about a student and his mom who were at an occupational therapy setting at one point. This young man, I'll use the pretend name of Jack, was in an occupational therapy session. During that session, he appropriately and on time requested to use the bathroom. He was at about the age of 6, and he was engaging in some bathroom accidents. So that was a really good thing, that he dashed off in time, got to the bathroom, used the bathroom, and dashed out too quickly without washing his hands. His occupational therapist looked at him and said, "Jack, wash your hands." Jack looked at her and said, "No." His occupational therapist said, "Jack, wash your hands." Jack said, "No." His occupational therapist said, "Jack, if you don't wash your hands, I'll tell your mother no ice cream after OT." Jack looked at her and said, "No." Mom came around the corner to save the day. She looked at Jack and said, "Jack, time to wash your hands. Hard soap or liquid soap?" He looked at her and he said, "Liquid," and ran back in the bathroom and washed his hands. That simple choice, hard soap or liquid soap, both were available in the bathroom. Once Jack made that choice, he ran in and washed his hands. That is a really effective prevention strategy. If you're interacting with a child with autism or a child with Asperger's disorder who's refusing to engage in a task, offer them a choice. Not the choice to do or not do the task. For example, the choice isn't, "It's time for math. Do you want to do it?" Instead, the choice is, "It's time for math. Do you want to do it in your chair at your desk or at the front table? Or do you want to use the fuzzy pencil or the pencil with the pencil grip? Or do you want to use the regular pencil or a colored pencil?" These kind of choices frequently allow the individual with autism a sense of control over their activity and frequently increase their compliance with the task itself. So the final point, providing choices, is a really good one when we're working with individuals with autism spectrum disorders. So the keys to prevention of problem behavior really get to the setting itself. And I'm going to break this setting down in a number of different ways. The first one is the physical setting. For individuals with autism, it really helps them if they understand the expectations based on where they are. So if my work table has all kind of toys on it, it looks to me like a person with autism, like I'm allowed to play here. So instead, we want to make sure that that work setting only has work on it and that the toys are in the break area. So we want to set up the physical setting to make it clear what's expected here. If we use the same table to play, to eat, snack, to work, to talk to each other, then it becomes confusing to the person with autism what's expected of them at any given time. And so we want to make sure that the expectations are clear based on what's present before them and what the setting says. It also helps if the setting is pretty organized. For folks with autism spectrum disorder, the more that an environment is disorganized, the more difficult it is for them to tell what's expected of them. The social setting should encourage health, and what I mean by that is that the adults and the children in the setting should encourage healthy interaction. So it's not helpful if people with autism are exclusively with other people with autism. They don't necessarily learn how to interact with others. So that's not a setting that necessarily encourages health. Now, there may be reasons why individuals with autism may be grouped with other individuals who share similar support needs, but we also want to make sure that they have the opportunity to interact with others that have different abilities than their abilities. We also want to make sure that the social setting encourages success. And so for the adults in the room, this means that that adult is frequently pointing out how to be successful in that environment. They're also frequently pointing out when the person with autism is successful. There's been a lot of research around how much positive interaction versus correction a person should receive regardless of their ability levels or their diagnoses. And the research says that there ought to be 5 positive interactions to 1 corrective or directive interaction. And so if you think about that, a social setting that encourages success has teachers that are very positive, that tell the child with autism that frequently, 5 times to every 1 time that they correct them, that they're doing well, that they're right on task, that they're on target. Way to go, buddy. I really like the way you fill in the blank. I like the way you shared your toys with others. I like the way you got ready when I said time to go. I like the way you put your work materials away. You're doing a great job on your work. All of that praise is an essential environment, an essential social environment setting that really helps prevent problem behavior. If I'm praising and pre-correcting problem behavior, that ounce of prevention saves me from having to deal with problem behavior on the other end. The activities in which a person with autism engages ought to be just right. I have the Goldilocks rule. Not too hard, not too easy, just right. Sometimes we see a lot of challenging behavior in classrooms where kids with ASD are bored. Likewise, we'll see challenging behavior in environments where students with autism spectrum disorders are asked to do tasks that are too hard for them. Or maybe they can do a part of the task but not the whole task. And so we want to make sure that we're providing the just right amount of instruction and challenge for the person with autism. This is particularly important at school. We also want to look at the degree to which the person is able to predict the expectations and the activities in the day. And so this gets to the use of visual schedules. There's an entire web seminar on how to implement visual supports for individuals with autism spectrum disorders on the Virginia Commonwealth University Autism Center for Excellence website. I really encourage you, if you are not currently using visual schedules, to look into using those for your students with autism spectrum disorders. It's a very important way that we can provide a lot of support to our individuals with ASD. Another way that we prevent problem behavior is by increasing the communication skills of our individuals with autism. This is a very important task and is the single most important thing we can teach children in school, and that is to communicate. If you think about our entire curriculum for all children, regardless of their disability or diagnoses, the point of school is to learn to communicate effectively. If you're learning to read, you're learning to understand communication in a written form. If you're learning math, you're learning to understand communicate about the world of numbers and the world of things in a quantitative manner. If you're learning science or social studies, you're learning to communicate about the world around you in terms of its social makeup, its history, or its scientific properties. All of education is communicating. For our students with autism spectrum disorder, I want you to make it your mission, your personal mission, as a teacher, as a paraprofessional, as a parent, as anybody who interacts with an individual with autism, to work on communication. This is a key to preventing problem behavior. I said earlier that problem behavior is communication. And consequently, we have to help our students with ASD communicate effectively in order to avoid situations where they engage in problem behavior. From the perspective of problem behavior and understanding function, remember I said that the two most common functions are to escape something difficult or to seek attention. Therefore, the two messages that are most essential are requesting a break, saying, I need a break, or requesting help. Help is a way to get attention. Taking a break is a way to avoid something that's difficult for you and calm yourself down. These are the most two important communicative messages that we could teach our students with autism spectrum disorders. Finally, we want to teach replacement behaviors that will prevent the problem behavior from occurring. In my example earlier, when my little guy with autism in preschool is bopping his peers on the head because he doesn't know how to play, I said the teacher could interact with that student before the problem behavior occurs by providing attention and then teaching that child how to play. A direct replacement behavior would be teaching that child to say, help me please, I don't know how. And if we teach that child either with a picture exchange or by saying those words or maybe even by signing those words, what we've given that child is the ability to meet their own attention needs and not wait for the teacher to anticipate and meet them for them. This is a way that we can prevent problem behavior from occurring is by teaching that child that replacement behavior of asking for help. We can also teach that child to tolerate waiting, but that has to come after we've taught that child. That waiting skill is a general skill that will promote more desired behaviors. It's also a coping and tolerance skill that allows us to teach children with autism how to tolerate uncomfortable situations like waiting for help or waiting for attention. O'Neill and his colleagues in a classic text on understanding the function of challenging behavior developed the competing behavior model. And I want to present it to you now. As you look at the chart on the screen, you'll see that the setting event is the slow trigger that I referred to earlier. Let's imagine that one of our individuals with autism doesn't get breakfast in the morning because their parents were too rushed or they didn't have anything that they liked to eat at breakfast in school. That might be the slow trigger that sets up the possibility that this person is going to be a little bit more grumpy. They're hungry and they don't feel so well. Then they have an antecedent that occurs. The teacher asks them to engage in a difficult task. The behavior that they engage in is right here in the middle of the screen. And this person screams, falls to the floor, and refuses to move. Now remember, they had no breakfast and have just been asked to complete a difficult task. And so the fact that they're screaming, falling to the floor, and refuses to move, it functions to help them escape the task. So we understand that the communication of this behavior is saying to the teacher, leave me alone. I don't want to do this. We then identify, gosh, if we could teach this student to ask for help or to ask for a break, they would also be able to escape that task. And so the replacement behavior is asking for a break. By teaching the child to ask for a break, they escape the task and they don't have to scream. In fact, it's easier to ask for a break than it is to scream and fall to the floor. And so it takes less effort, and we need the teacher to respond immediately. As soon as the child says, break please, or hands over the break card, the work disappears. Now we know if that's the only skill we teach that child, they won't become more independent and they won't do this difficult task that they need to do. So the other behavior that we want to teach is attempting the task. But we can't teach attempting the task until the child trusts us that we'll give them a break when they really need it. So we teach the replacement behavior first. Once the child establishes this behavior, then we teach how to attempt the task. And we teach this by providing lots of praise and maybe even some additional reinforcement that makes trying this task worth the child's time. And so if we go back to that whole sequence, what we want to see is, first of all, we want to make sure that the child has something to eat and isn't so hungry before they're presented with a difficult task. Once they're presented with a difficult task, we want to be ready to teach them to ask for a break. And then once they learn how to ask for a break, then we want to teach them how to attempt the task and offer them increased praise and increased positive reinforcement for attempting the task. This competing behavior model by O'Neill really helps us understand how to intervene effectively when we're supporting individuals with autism spectrum disorder. It also helps us identify the behaviors that we want to teach to in effect change that problem behavior. Teaching versus controlling really helps us by adding skills and increasing self-esteem, and most importantly, increasing the person's competence. If I teach a young child with autism spectrum disorders to request help, I've increased their competence over the long haul. Compare that to simply suppressing behavior. By suppressing the behavior by using a punitive procedure or by putting the person in detention, suspension, or timeout, I've implied that this person can't control themselves. I've increased their learned helplessness, and I've increased the need for them using that problem behavior in the future. I want to teach new behaviors to replace the problem behavior rather than simply controlling the old behavior. So I want to engage in a lot of behavioral strategies to teach the new behavior. These include role play and reverse role play, where I give the person steps for how to ask for help or how to ask for a break. I want to embed my repeated trials across the day. That means I want to seize natural opportunities and I want to engineer more opportunities. So in the example that I showed earlier, for the student who is having difficulty when they're presented with a difficult task, I actually might plan a few more difficult tasks in the day. Before I present those tasks, I say to the person, let's say it's Jack again, I say to Jack, "Jack, how do you ask for help?" And Jack says, "Give you my card," or he hands the help card, and we practice that a couple of times. And then I say, "Jack, remember, if you need help, give me the help card." I present the work, the difficult task. I'm right there waiting and I'm pointing to the help card because we've just practiced it. Jack has a difficult task in front of him and I'm pointing to the help card. If Jack immediately hands me that help card, I help Jack right away and I remove the task. If Jack forgets and begins to show signs that he's going to engage in the problem behavior, I actually might help him hand over hand to hand me the help card. That's how I'm going to role play and seize natural opportunities to teach Jack to ask for help. By doing this, I can then reinforce him for asking for help immediately by saying, "Oh, sure, Jack, I'll help you. Let me move this task and let's do the easier task instead." So by teaching Jack consistently how to ask for help, and by really assisting him, by giving him more opportunities to practice that, I begin to establish asking for help as the behavior instead of screaming, crying, falling to the floor, and throwing things. This method requires that everybody who works in the child practice those skills with him regularly. What I usually say to a school team is that if we're implementing a strategy like this, I want everybody who works with the child to practice those behaviors 3 or 4 times a day. So that means the paraprofessional has to practice teaching Jack to ask for help 3 or 4 times a day. The teacher has to practice teaching Jack to ask for help 3 or 4 times a day. And mom or dad or other caretakers at home also have to practice teaching Jack to ask for help 3 or 4 times a day. If we all do that, Jack's going to get 12 to 15 chances a day to practice asking for help. And by practicing that often, Jack's going to probably learn how to ask for help before he engages in the problem behavior. That's how we go about teaching a new behavior to replace a problem behavior. Once we've taught that new behavior, then we have to respond pretty quickly with the desired experience that Jack wants. In the case of Jack, he wanted a break. And so by having everybody practice that with him regularly and teaching him how to do it, we give him the break. So we use our positive incentives, our positive reinforcements, to make the new behavior stronger. If Jack engages in a tantrum right then, we prompt him through asking for help. And we treat that problem behavior now as a learning error. Jack forgot how to ask for help, so we reteach him. And by reteaching him, we have the opportunity for him to practice those skills again. We may have to wait a little while until Jack's calm enough to practice that, but we treat that problem behavior as a learning error. We frequently use token boards, because if we give Jack a break every single time we present the problem behavior, then what happens is he may not become more independent at this. And so what we might do is then, once he establishes that behavior, we might ask him to wait 3 times before he gets his break. So I might laminate a piece of cardboard or oak tag, and then I'm going to use some kind of token like poker chips, or sometimes people put Velcro on the back of pennies, to give someone like Jack very specific visual concrete markers to let him know that he can get his M&Ms or his break if he makes it 3 times trying a difficult activity. So in this case, I put a poker chip on every time Jack tries the activity without screaming or falling to the floor. And by that way, he can actually count the number of chips he needs before he gets the reinforcer. In this case, he needs 1 more poker chip, and then he gets the reinforcer, in this case the M&Ms. It might be the break that he's looking for instead. Whatever the reinforcer is, I want to make it really clear by using a token board. Another way to do this is by using a sticker or a check sheet. This is for a student who maybe has used the token board in the past. And in this case, this student has to make it through calendar and activities by keeping his hands and feet to himself, listening to his teacher, doing his work, and asking for help. And these stickers help him keep track of whether or not he's meeting those expectations. And so during calendar, he did all of the behaviors except he forgot to ask for help. During centers, he forgot to keep his hands and feet to himself, and he forgot to ask for help. He understands that he needs 6 stickers to get computer time, and computer time is really valuable to him. And so by using this sticker sheet, it really helps him know how he's doing, and it focuses on the problem behavior, or excuse me, on the positive behaviors that we're using to teach him. We want to gradually thin reinforcement over time. We don't want to go from Jack getting a token every single time to every 5 times. That's going to be too much of a bump. And so what we want to do is we want to move from a reinforcement for a correct response to a reinforcement for every 1 to 3 correct responses. And by that way, we're fading from reinforcement every time to reinforcement every few times. We want to make this move gradually so that someone like Jack doesn't resort back to the problem behavior that he displayed before. We want him to keep using the new behavior, asking for help, and gradually and slowly move him to a more natural reinforcement schedule. Whenever we ask for help, we don't always get help. And so we want to very gradually move from giving Jack help every time to giving Jack help every 3rd or 4th time. The main points of using prevention is to use positive reinforcement. And again, you want to use more positive reinforcement than you do direction or correction. You really want to increase this person's access to the reinforcement that they're already getting for the problem behavior that they're displaying. And by doing this, you are actually shifting from the negative behavior to more positive behaviors. And so by regularly assessing what the person wants and providing that to them for the positive behaviors, you're going to automatically decrease and prevent the problem behaviors from occurring. At the end of this webcast, I have a few visual strategies that I want to show you that really help us do this very effectively. I mentioned earlier that we use choices. There's a wonderful little book that was published by Linda Hodgson in 1999. It's called 10 Tried and True Tools to Turn Trials into Teamwork. This book gave 10 strategies on how to use visual strategies effectively for supporting someone with autism, specifically in making choices and displaying appropriate behavior. And so I'm going to show you some examples from that book right now. The first one is offering choices. And so using visual strategies for a home-based problem behavior, which is avoiding brushing my teeth, you might have multiple kinds of toothbrushes that the person could pick from. And in this example, you can see there are pictures of the various toothbrushes that the person can choose. You might have actual pictures of the toothbrushes themselves. And so instead of saying, go brush your teeth, you might say, it's time to brush your teeth. Which toothbrush do you want to use? In school, you might offer a student choices when there's a substitute. Frequently, when there's a substitute teacher, students with autism display more problem behavior because they don't know what the expectations are. By providing them with some choices like asking for help, do your work, or play at playtime, this might help the student understand what's expected of them. Here's another home strategy. These are bedtime things to do. And what they do is they help you communicate with your child with autism how to make choices about what to do at bedtime. You'll notice the choices don't include running around and getting louder, but they help the person identify what they need to do to prepare themselves to go to bed. Another way to help the person with autism is to take bigger tasks and break it down into chunks. And take difficult concepts like wait here and break it down into chunks. There's a very helpful tool that was developed by Pat Miranda with her colleague. This was published in 2006. These are called behavior maps, and they're visual maps that show contingencies. And so this one is for a school where you see it says, when you're in line, keep your hands in your pocket and you get a treat. That's the top level of this map. If you follow the bottom level, when in line, hit other kids, I do not get a treat. It helps the person with autism understand the contingencies, that getting a treat is connected to keeping my hands in my pocket when I'm staying in line. This really helps a person with autism understand the expectations. Here's a home example of a behavior map. When I'm in the grocery store, I stay with the cart, listen to mom, I get a treat. When I'm shopping, run around, grab things, I do not get my treat. Now, this behavior map in and of itself won't fix a problem behavior. It's a tool to help you help the person practice those behaviors. So if you're a mom and you're looking at this and you're thinking, wow, I now have the cure for my shopping woes with my child with autism, I want to caution you. You've got to go in and you've got to practice these behaviors with the child regularly. And so in this case, I'd practice this in small little doses. So I might go into a grocery store and I might buy a loaf of bread, and then right away I'm able to give my child with autism a treat for being successful in staying with me while we buy one loaf of bread. Next week, we might buy a loaf of bread and a pitcher of milk. The week after that, we might buy a loaf of bread, a box of cereal, and a pitcher of milk. In other words, little by little, we extend the number of things that we buy while the child stays with the cart, listens to mom, and gets the treat. Here's another behavior map that might help at home when mom is cooking. Another time when kids in general, not just kids with autism, might display some challenging behaviors. For children with autism, they might not understand the process, that it takes time for mom to cook. And so you see again, when mom is cooking, I keep my hands in my pocket, I wait, and then I get dessert. If I hit others or break things, I don't get dessert. Again, you're going to want to practice this in slow steps. This is one of the original behavior maps that Pat Miranda and her colleagues developed, and it helps the person with autism understand the concept of waiting. So you see, you begin with, I want that. There's something that the person with autism wants. The parent says, please wait. Play by yourself. You'll get it later. On the other hand, the problem behaviors are wanting something, keep asking, cry, or grab it, I will not get it. Again, these behavior maps are designed to assist the person with autism in understanding some of these difficult concepts. Some other ways we use visual systems is teaching the person to ask for help, to ask for a break, and to teach communication in general. Some of our other webcasts will address teaching communication, specifically teaching the picture exchange communication system, incidental teaching, or verbal behavior analysis. There will be other webcasts on these topics. We started by talking about the 3 S's. That in order to decrease and prevent problem behavior, we want the person to be safe, secure, and successful. And as it turns out, when we provide this for the person with autism, you're safe, secure, and successful as well. Thank you again for attending this webcast. If you're attending this live, I look forward to chatting with you in a few minutes. If you're viewing this via the archive on our website, thank you again for your time, and I hope you found this helpful.